The doctor's grim words echoed in Grace Keller's ears as she rode away from Silver Creek, her vision blurred by tears that refused to fall. "You'll never bear children, Miss Keller. That fever you survived last winter. The damage is permanent." The year was 1878, and at 26, Grace had just learned that the future she had quietly dreamed of, a home filled with children's laughter, would never be hers. The Arizona Territory stretched before her, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. Grace urged her mare forward, wanting distance between herself and the doctor's office, between herself and the pitying glances from townsfolk who had surely already heard the news. News traveled fast in small towns like Silver Creek. "Easy, Penny," she murmured as her horse picked up speed, responding to her anxiety. It is not the end of the world, but it felt like it. Grace had come west 3 years earlier after losing her parents to influenza back in Boston. With her teaching credentials and determination, she had secured the position of schoolteacher in Silver Creek. She loved her students, all 18 of them ranging from 6 to 16, but teaching other people's children had never been her only ambition. The sound of hoofbeats behind her made Grace straighten her back and quickly wipe her eyes. She wouldn't be caught weeping like some fragile Eastern lily. She had built a reputation as the steady, sensible schoolteacher who could handle anything from schoolyard fights to rattlesnakes in the outhouse. Miss Keller, hold up," Grace recognized the voice immediately. Jackson Forrester, the tall, broad-shouldered rancher whose land bordered the town to the north. His younger sister Abigail was one of Grace's brightest students, and Grace had occasionally exchanged pleasantries with him at town gatherings. More than pleasantries, if she were honest with herself. There had been moments glances held a second too long, fingers brushing when he handed her into a wagon, a dance at last year's harvest festival that had left her flushed for reasons unrelated to exertion. She slowed Penny to a stop and took a deep breath before turning to face him. "Mr. Forrester," she acknowledged with a nod, hoping her eyes weren't red. Jackson Forrester pulled his chestnut gelding alongside her. At 32, the rancher had the weathered face of a man who spent his days under the unforgiving western sun, but his eyes were kind. Today they were also concerned. "You rode past me like the devil himself was on your heels," he said, his voice gentle. "Everything all right, perfectly fine," Grace replied, the lie bitter on her tongue. "Just enjoying the afternoon." Jackson's eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't a man easily fooled. Heading anywhere in particular? It'll be dark in a couple hours. Grace hadn't thought that far ahead. She had simply needed to escape. "Just getting some air. I'll turn back shortly." Jackson nodded, though his expression suggested he didn't quite believe her. "Mind if I ride with you a ways? I've been meaning to ask you about Abigail's reading. She seems to have taken to those Shakespeare plays you lent her." Grace couldn't help but smile. 15-year-old Abigail Forrester had indeed discovered a passion for Shakespeare, often staying after school to discuss the plays with Grace. "She has a remarkable mind. You should be proud." "I am," Jackson said simply, "though I confess most of it goes over my head." "Last night she was reciting something about quality of mercy not being strained. Nearly put me to sleep faster than a shot of whiskey." Despite herself, Grace laughed. "The Merchant of Venice. The quality of mercy is not strained, it droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath." Jackson grinned, revealing a dimple in his right cheek that Grace had always found unreasonably charming. "That's the one. She wants to be like you know, smart and educated." The compliment warmed Grace even as it reminded her of all she had lost that day. She would never see her own daughter recite Shakespeare, never teach her own son to read. The thought caused her throat to tighten painfully. "Miss Keller, Grace," Jackson said, his voice softer now. "I don't mean to pry, but I saw you coming from Doc Morrison's office earlier. Are you unwell?" Grace stared straight ahead, watching the sagebrush sway in the light breeze. "Not exactly unwell, no." They rode in silence for a moment, the only sounds the creak of leather and the rhythmic footfalls of their horses. My wife died in childbirth, Jackson said suddenly. 5 years ago now. Her and the baby both. Grace turned to him, startled by the personal revelation. I'm so sorry, Mr. Forrester, I didn't know. Jackson, he corrected gently. And most folks don't know. I don't talk about it much, especially around Abigail. It hit her hard, losing Emily like that. He paused. The reason I mention it is, well, I know what it's like to have your future change in an instant, to walk out of a doctor's office with your world turned upside down. Grace felt tears threatening again. This man saw too much. The doctor says I cannot have children, she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. The fever last winter. It damaged something inside me. She expected pity or perhaps awkward silence. What she didn't expect was the steady, warm gaze that met hers. I'm sorry, Jackson said simply. That's a heavy burden to carry. It shouldn't matter so much, Grace said, angry at herself for the catch in her voice. I have my students. I have a good life here. It matters because it matters to you, Jackson replied. No need to pretend otherwise, at least not with me. They had reached a small creek, and by unspoken agreement, both dismounted to let their horses drink. Grace stood watching the water flow over smooth stones, aware of Jackson's presence beside her, not too close, but close enough that she could feel the solid reassurance of him. When Emily died, he said after a while, folks told me I'd find another wife, have more children. As if Emily and our baby were things that could be replaced. He picked up a small stone and turned it over in his hand. They meant well, but they didn't understand that it wasn't just about having a wife or having children. It was about having that future with her. Grace nodded, understanding all too well. People will say I can still marry, still be a mother to stepchildren. She laughed, but it was a hollow sound. As if any man would want a barren wife. Jackson looked at her then, his gaze so intense that Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. Any man worth his salt would want a woman like you, Grace Keller, regardless of whether you can bear children. The sincerity in his voice made something flutter in Grace's chest. Before she could respond, the sound of distant thunder rumbled across the plains. Storm's coming, Jackson said, glancing at the darkening sky to the west. We should head back. They mounted quickly and turned their horses toward town. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of rain and sage. They rode faster as the first fat drops began to fall, but within minutes, the skies opened in a torrential downpour. My place is closer, Jackson shouted over the rain. Just over that rise, Grace nodded, blinking through the rain. They crested the hill, and she saw the Forrester ranch spread out below a sturdy 2-story house, a large barn and several outbuildings, all nestled in a protected valley. By the time they reached the barn, they were both soaked to the skin. Jackson dismounted quickly and came to help Grace down, his hands strong and sure at her waist. For a moment they stood close, rain dripping from the brim of his hat onto her upturned face. You're shivering, he said, his voice low. Just cold, Grace replied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Jackson led the horses into the barn, and Grace followed, wringing water from her skirts. The familiar smells of hay and horses surrounded them as Jackson quickly unsaddled their mounts and rubbed them down. Abigail's staying with her friend Sarah tonight, Jackson explained as he worked. But Mrs. Henderson, our housekeeper, should be in the main house. She can find you some dry clothes. Grace nodded, suddenly conscious of her sodden appearance. Her carefully pinned hair had come loose in the rain and now hung in damp tendrils around her face. Her light blue dress, perfectly proper for a schoolteacher, now clung to her in a way that made her flush with embarrassment. Jackson seemed to sense her discomfort. He removed his coat and draped it around her shoulders. It was wet, but the residual warmth from his body was comforting. "Thank you," Grace murmured. "Let's get you inside," Jackson said, and she heard something in his voice, a careful restraint that made her wonder what he was thinking. They dashed through the rain to the main house, a handsome structure built of sturdy logs with a wide front porch. Inside, the house was warm and inviting, with a large stone fireplace dominating the sitting room. "Mrs. Henderson," Jackson called, but there was no answer. He frowned. She must have gone home early because of the storm. Her cabin's just behind the orchard. "Oh," Grace said, suddenly aware that they were alone. In any other circumstance, this would be scandalously improper, but the storm continued to rage outside, making departure impossible. "I'll find you something dry to wear," Jackson said, disappearing upstairs. He returned moments later with a bundle of clothing. "These were Emily's," he explained, his expression unreadable. "They should fit well enough." Grace accepted the clothes with murmured thanks, oddly touched that he would offer his late wife's garments. Jackson showed her to a small bedroom where she could change, then excused himself to do the same. Alone, Grace peeled off her wet clothing and slipped into the borrowed dress, a simple blue cotton that was indeed a reasonable fit. She combed her fingers through her damp hair, wishing for a proper brush, and wondered what Jackson Forrester thought of her now bedraggled, unmarried, and barren. When she emerged, she found Jackson in the kitchen, stoking a fire in the cast-iron stove. He had changed into dry clothes as well, and his hair curled damply at the nape of his neck. "I thought you might want some hot coffee," he said, "or tea if you prefer." "Coffee would be wonderful," Grace replied, hovering uncertainly in the doorway. Jackson gestured to a chair at the kitchen table. "Sit, make yourself comfortable. Looks like this storm might last a while." Grace sat, watching as he moved efficiently around the kitchen, measuring coffee grounds into a pot. There was something strangely intimate about seeing this man whom she had only ever encountered in public settings performing such domestic tasks. "You cook for yourself often?" she asked, curious. Jackson glanced at her with a half-smile. "When Mrs. Henderson isn't here, yes, I'm not as helpless as some men. Emily taught me a few things, and after she died." He shrugged. "A man learns what he needs to survive." He placed the coffee pot on the stove and joined her at the table. Outside, rain lashed against the windows, and occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the darkening landscape. "I should apologize," Grace said suddenly. Jackson raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For burdening you with my situation. It was highly inappropriate." "Grace," Jackson said, her name soft on his lips. "There's no need for apologies between friends. The word both warmed and disappointed her, though she couldn't say why. "Still," she persisted, "it's hardly proper conversation, especially with a man." Jackson's mouth quirked. "I think we're well past worrying about propriety, given that you're sitting in my kitchen wearing my late wife's dress while a storm makes it impossible for you to leave." Put that way, Grace had to smile. "I suppose you're right." The coffee began to bubble, and Jackson rose to pour 2 cups, adding a splash of cream to each. He placed one before Grace and sat down again, closer this time. "May I speak plainly?" he asked, his eyes serious. Grace nodded, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "When Emily died, I thought that part of my life was over, the part where I loved someone so much that losing them nearly destroyed me." He took a breath. "For a long time, I was just going through the motions for Abigail's sake. And then, about a year ago, I noticed something." "What?" Grace asked when he paused. "I noticed you," Jackson said simply, "not just as Abigail's teacher, but as a woman. A woman with intelligence and kindness and a strength that most people around here don't even recognize." Grace felt her heart begin to pound. "Mr. Forrester Jackson, let me finish," he said gently. "I've been trying to find the courage to court you properly for months now. I almost asked you to dance at the Founders' Day celebration last month, but I lost my nerve when Mayor Jenkins got to you first." Despite herself, Grace laughed. "Mayor Jenkins has 3 left feet and stepped on my toes no fewer than 5 times. Jackson smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I noticed. It took considerable restraint not to cut in." "Why didn't you?" Grace asked softly. "Because I wanted to do things right. I wanted to call on you at your boarding house, bring you flowers, take you for proper Sunday drives." His expression grew more serious. "But today, when I saw you riding away from town looking like your world had ended, I knew I couldn't wait any longer to at least try to be your friend. There was that word again. Grace stared into her coffee cup, not trusting herself to speak. "What I'm trying to say," Jackson continued, "is that whatever you learned from Doc Morrison today doesn't change how I see you, and if friendship is all you want from me, I'll respect that. But I'd be lying if I said I hadn't hoped for more." Grace looked up, startled by his directness. "You can't mean that, not now that you know. That you can't have children?" Jackson reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused. "Grace, I already raised one child largely on my own. If God sees fit to send more children our way somehow, I'd welcome them. But that's not why I've been watching you across crowded rooms for the past year." "Then why?" Grace whispered. "Because you're the first person who made me want to live again, not just survive." Jackson's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "Because you have a laugh that makes everyone around you want to laugh too. Because you're brave enough to teach 18 children with nothing but books and your own wits. Because when you recite Shakespeare, even I can understand why people have been reading his words for centuries." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes again, but these were different from the bitter tears she had fought earlier. These were tears of something that felt dangerously like hope. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't have to say anything now," Jackson replied. "I know this is sudden and you've had a difficult day. I just wanted you to know that you're not alone and that your worth isn't measured by whether you can bear children." Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Jackson seemed to understand. He squeezed her hand once more, then released it, rising to check on the storm through the window. "It's letting up," he reported, "but the roads will be mud. You're welcome to stay until morning. Abigail's room is yours, of course." "Thank you," Grace said, finding her voice at last. "For everything." Jackson turned back to her, his expression gentle. "Get some rest, Grace. Things often look clearer in the morning light." That night, lying in Abigail's narrow bed, Grace stared at the ceiling and thought about Jackson Forrester. About the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. About the way he had spoken of his late wife with love, but without the raw grief of a wound still bleeding. About how it had felt to have someone see her, truly see her, on what should have been the worst day of her life. Morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean. Grace rose early, finding her own clothes dried and pressed Jackson's work, she realized with a flutter in her stomach. She changed quickly and made her way downstairs, following the scent of coffee and bacon. Jackson stood at the stove, his back to her. "Good morning," he said without turning. "Sleep well?" "Yes, thank you," Grace replied, wondering how he had known she was there. "You didn't have to cook breakfast. I wanted to," Jackson said, turning to face her with a plate of bacon and eggs. "Sit. Eat. Then I'll take you back to town before people start to talk." They ate in companionable silence, the events of the previous day creating a strange intimacy between them. When they had finished, Jackson cleared the plates away and then stood looking at her, his expression uncertain for the first time since she had known him. "Grace," he began, "I meant what I said yesterday, all of it, but I understand if you need time or if you don't feel the same way." Grace rose from her chair and took a step toward him. "I don't need time," she said softly. "What I need is to thank you for showing me that yesterday wasn't an ending, just a different path than the one I expected to walk." Jackson's eyes darkened. "And is it a path you might consider walking with company?" "With the right company," Grace replied, her heart racing. "Yes." Jackson closed the distance between them slowly, giving her every chance to step away. But Grace held her ground, tilting her face up to his as his hands came to rest lightly on her waist. "May I kiss you, Grace Keller?" he asked, his voice husky. "Yes," she whispered, and then his lips were on hers, gentle at first, then with growing intensity as she responded. Grace had been kissed before chaste pecks from eager suitors back in Boston, but never like this. Never with this sense of coming home to something she hadn't even known she was missing. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "I should take you back to town," he said reluctantly. "Yes," Grace agreed, equally reluctant. "My students will be waiting and people will talk." "Let them talk," Jackson said with a grin, stealing another quick kiss. Though perhaps we should try to maintain some semblance of propriety, at least until I've had a chance to court you properly. Is that what you're going to do? Grace asked, unable to keep the smile from her voice. Court me. With your permission, Jackson replied, suddenly serious. I know yesterday changed things for you. I know you're still coming to terms with what the doctor told you. I don't want to rush you or make you feel that this is your only option. Grace placed a hand against his cheek, touched by his consideration. Jackson Forrester, I've been watching you too, you know, longer than you might think. Yesterday didn't change how I feel about you, it just made me believe I had nothing to offer. Nothing to offer, Jackson looked genuinely puzzled. Grace, you have everything to offer. Intelligence, compassion, strength, but not children, Grace interrupted. And most men want sons to carry on their name, their legacy. Jackson took her hands in his. What I want is a partner, someone to share my life with, to help raise Abigail, to build something meaningful together. He paused. If that partner happens to be a beautiful Shakespeare-quoting schoolteacher who has already captured my heart, then all the better, Grace laughed, feeling lighter than she had in days. When you put it that way, how can a girl refuse? Is that a yes? Jackson asked, hope brightening his eyes. Yes to courting, Grace clarified. The rest, well, we'll see where the path leads us. Jackson nodded, clearly pleased. That's all I ask for now, a chance to show you what we could be together. They rode back to town side by side, maintaining a respectable distance but exchanging glances that spoke volumes. At the edge of town, Jackson escorted her to the small boarding house where she rented rooms. May I call on you on Sunday? He asked formally, though his eyes danced with private humor. Perhaps take you for a drive after church. I would like that very much, Grace replied with equal formality, though she couldn't help the smile that tugged at her lips. True to his word, Jackson called on her that Sunday and the next, and the one after that. They drove through the countryside in his buggy, picnicked by the same creek where they had stopped on that fateful day, and spent long evenings on the porch of the boarding house, talking until Mrs. Whittaker, the landlady, pointedly came to lock up. Word spread quickly through Silver Creek that the widower Forrester was courting the schoolteacher. Some tongues wagged about the impropriety of her having spent a night at his ranch during the storm, but most townsfolk were supportive, especially after seeing the way Jackson looked at Grace when he thought no one was watching. 3 months after the day at the doctor's office, Jackson proposed properly, down on one knee in the schoolyard after the children had gone home. Grace accepted without hesitation, her heart too full for anything but joy. They were married in the small church in Silver Creek, with Abigail serving as Grace's maid of honor. The teenager had been thrilled at the news of their engagement, confiding to Grace that she had been hoping for exactly this outcome ever since her brother had started finding excuses to attend school functions. Life at the Forrester ranch took on a new rhythm with Grace's presence. She continued teaching, riding to and from town each day on Penny. In the evenings, she, Jackson, and Abigail would gather around the table, sharing the day's events. On weekends, they worked together tending the vegetable garden Grace had started, repairing fences, organizing the small but growing library that now occupied one corner of the sitting room. 6 months into their marriage, Grace received a letter that changed everything once again. It was from a former student who had moved to Santa Fe with her family the previous year. The girl wrote that her cousin, a young widow, had died in childbirth, leaving behind a healthy baby girl with no family to claim her. They're looking for a good home for the child, Grace told Jackson that night, her hands trembling as she held the letter. Someone who will raise her with love and education. Jackson looked at his wife, seeing the hope she was afraid to voice. And you're thinking that someone could be us. Is it foolish, Grace asked, her voice small, to think we could just take in a child we've never met? Not foolish at all, Jackson said, taking the letter and reading it through. In fact, I think it's the most sensible thing I've heard all day. You do." Grace searched his face for any sign of hesitation. "Grace," Jackson said, setting the letter aside and taking her hands. "When I asked you to marry me, I told you that children might come to us in unexpected ways. This may be one of those ways." "But a baby," Grace said, both excited and terrified. "I've never cared for an infant before." "Neither have I," Jackson admitted with a grin. "But between the two of us and Mrs. Henderson, I reckon we can figure it out." "And Abigail," Grace asked. "How would she feel about a baby sister?" "Why don't we ask her?" Jackson suggested and called Abigail in from the porch where she had been reading. The teenager's response was enthusiastic. "A baby? Here? Oh, can we please? I've always wanted a little sister," and so it was decided. 2 weeks later, Jackson and Grace traveled to Santa Fe and returned with tiny Julia, just 8 weeks old, with a dusting of dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. The adjustment wasn't always easy. There were sleepless nights and moments of doubt, times when Grace wondered if she was doing right by this child who had already lost so much. But there was also joy pure, undiluted joy in watching Julia grow, in seeing Jackson cradle her with such tenderness, in hearing Abigail sing lullabies to her baby sister. On a warm evening a year after Julia's arrival, Grace sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and pink. Julia slept in her arms, her small body warm and trusting. Inside, she could hear Jackson and Abigail preparing dinner, their voices raised in good-natured argument about the proper amount of salt for cornbread. Grace looked down at the sleeping child not born of her body but absolutely a child of her heart, and felt a completeness she had never thought possible on that dark day when she had ridden away from the doctor's office. The screen door creaked, and Jackson stepped out onto the porch. He stood for a moment, just looking at his wife and daughter, his expression so full of love that Grace felt her heart might burst. "Penny, for your thoughts," he said softly, coming to sit beside her on the swing. "I was just thinking about how wrong the doctor was," Grace replied, shifting Julia slightly so Jackson could slip an arm around her shoulders. "He said I'd never bear children, but he was mistaken." "How so?" Jackson asked, though the smile in his eyes suggested he already knew her answer. "Because bearing children isn't just about carrying them in your body," Grace said, leaning into her husband's solid warmth. "It's about carrying them in your heart, supporting them as they grow, bearing their sorrows and joys as your own." Jackson pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. "You're a wonderful mother, Grace Forrester." "And you're a wonderful father," she replied. "Even if you do put too much salt in the cornbread." Jackson laughed, the sound stirring Julia, who blinked sleepily up at them. "There's my girl," he murmured, touching the baby's cheek with one finger. "Did Mama and Papa wake you?" Julia gave them a gummy smile that never failed to melt Grace's heart. "I remember what you said to me," Grace said softly, looking up at her husband. "That day by the creek when I told you what the doctor had said. You kissed me and told me I had already given you love, and that was enough." "And I meant it," Jackson replied, his eyes serious now. "This," he gestured to include Julia, the house behind them, the life they had built together. "This is everything I could have wanted and more. But even if it had just been you and me and Abigail, that would have been enough too." "I know," Grace said, and she did. She knew with absolute certainty that this man had seen her value when she couldn't see it herself, had loved her not for what she could give him but for who she was. "I love you, Jackson Forrester," she said, the words simple but carrying the weight of all they had become to each other. "And I love you, Grace Forrester," he replied, bending to kiss her as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above their home.